Hi there, I'm Tom Spencer. This week on Central Texas Gardener, Susan Orlean, author of The Orchid Thief, chronicles her journalistic exploration into the fascinating world of orchids. On tour, discover more of their secrets in Monica Gaylord's home greenhouse. Now let's get growing right here, right now.
Support for Central Texas Gardener comes from GeoGrowers, offering custom soil blends for lawns, gardens, xeriscaping, and organic landscaping supplies. More information at geogrowers.net. And also from The Blanket, a plant covering designed to be lightweight, breathable, and water resistant to help keep plants warm and dry during harsh winter weather. theblanket.com.
Orchids are among the most fascinating plants in the world. Let's discover some of their secrets in Monica Gaylord's greenhouse.
Monica Gaylord doesn't have to catch a plane to experience what she discovered in childhood, the power of a plant to infuse our early senses and leave its impression long after it drops its flowers and we grow up.
I actually was a Navy brat in Hawaii. My dad had a ship and we followed him all around the world. And we had two stints in Hawaii. It was 6 years. And when I went outside, everyone's yard looked like this. It was the ideal environment for a little kid to grow up, surrounded by such beauty. So when I moved to hot, arid Texas, naturally, I had to recreate what I had experienced growing up. And I'm really glad I did.
She did it with an orchid greenhouse that opens off the bedroom. After a busy day, Monica and husband Richard find downtime and renewal among the plants that evolved to adapt to whatever life threw their way.
I kind of went overboard. I used to have a very stressful job, and every time I was just at my wit's end, I ran out and bought an orchid. There's actually 35,000 or so different species of orchids, and then you take this orchid and mix it with this orchid and make a new hybrid. So there's hundreds of thousands of those, and more every single day. I haven't tried to do that. I don't do lab work. If you start an orchid from seed, it actually takes about 7 years to go from the flask to a bloom, and I don't have the patience for that. So I kind of like the instant beauty, and then I just grow it bigger and bigger. The fragrance is an important part of why I collect some orchids. I actually have some orchids that we hang very close to the bedroom.
That's why she added specimens that release their fragrance only at night, to entice a distinctive moth in the wild.
A lot of these are from Africa or warmer regions. I don't know if you can see, it has this long spur right here. So here's the flower. The pollinator for this plant actually is a moth with a really long tongue because the nectar is down here. So it's got to reach all the way down there, and then it pollinates. That's the reward.
An orchid's botanical complexity, geared to attract discreet pollinators and no other, stimulated Monica's intrigue. Plus, in her greenhouse, she can globetrot without leaving Austin.
That's a macara. That's a very common orchid, actually. It's a cutting orchid in Thailand. They grow them by the acres. It's a really easy one to grow here in Austin, though. It likes the bright light. It's pretty indestructible. If I do forget to water for a week or two, it's not affected at all. Because it is such a large plant, it can kind of slough off my laziness.
Other orchids are very tiny.
And if I had them in a pot, they'd probably just get lost. And if I had them tucked in here, they'd definitely get lost. So I put them all on a sunnier wall and a little bit shadier wall, but they're all the miniatures together, which I think is a good idea for a couple of reasons. They're easier to walk up and look at, and they won't get lost. And then also they take a little bit more water. Because they're on a raft, those tend to dry out. When I say a raft, it's like a piece of wood or cork or whatever. But you can actually use almost anything. But they're attached to the wood, and they need to be watered about every other day. They're a little bit more fussy, but they reward you with really amazing blooms. The plant could be this big, and the flower could be this big.
Dendrobiums are the orchid of choice for leis.
This is a Rhyncha stylus, and they always bloom this time of year. There's 3 or 4 different forms. There's a solid white, there's a blue and white, and there's this purple and maybe one or two others, but this is an old faithful. Look at these roots.
Usually, escaping roots would frighten a gardener into repotting action. For some orchids, that's their lifeline.
Most of these are epiphytes, meaning they're hanging on a tree, but they get actually nothing from their host, nothing. So you need a bird or a monkey or something to run by or fly by and deposit, and that's the fertilizer. When the rain comes, it washes it down these roots, and the root tips that are green, that shows a healthy root, but actually the entire root absorbs that fertilizer. If you have orchids and you're watering them with water, they're getting absolutely nothing. You need to water in order to get them to rebloom with fertilizer almost every time you water. That's the key. But this is their lifeblood. That's the system that they absorb everything.
One size doesn't fit all when growing orchids. Each requires a habitat that mimics its genetic provenance. Monica installed an evaporative cooling wall to expand her geographic choices.
Those orchids that need the higher light, like these vandas and ascascendas and things, I've got higher up. The ones that need a little lower light, I have lower on the bench. The ones that need more coolness, because they may be from China or somewhere a little cooler, they're right in front of the cool wall. So I actually have different climates within the greenhouse. I imagine that this is just like in the jungle. The plants are in the height of the tree or in the middle of the tree or at the forest floor. Either way, the monsoon comes in, they're drenched and refreshed. The air comes along following the monsoon and dries out the plants so there's no disease and fungus and things like that. So that's what I've tried to create in my greenhouse. If you're growing in your home or on the windowsill, it's nice to have some good air movement. It's nice if you put your orchids on a little tray of pebbles and keep water in the tray, because that creates a little bit of humidity. I would recommend a bright, indirect lighted window. So probably try to avoid the late afternoon sun. That's a killer. Phalaenopsis, those are great. Those are the perfect ones to practice on. If you can grow a phal, which pretty much everybody can, then you can graduate into, vandas or dendrobiums or whatever. Each bloom comes successively. So over a period of, let's say, 3 months, from the first bloom to the last bloom, that's a great buy for $20. They're easy to find, they're easy to grow, and I think they're really rewarding, because then you go, oh, look, I grew an orchid. But all the orchids have just interesting leaves and interesting flowers. So even if the orchid's not in bloom, you still have an interesting plant to look at. That's one of the things that really fascinates me about the orchid world. I can garden year-round. It's nice and temperate in here. It's the ideal place for me to really relieve some stress and relax and enjoy my passion. It's what I need to be whole.
Step into orchid heaven yourself at the Heart of Texas Orchid Society Show and Sale on April 28th and 29th at Zilker Botanical Garden. Find out more at hotos.org.
Thank you, Monica. Being in your greenhouse is like being in a paradise. That was really great. Well, today I'm sitting in for Tom Spencer. I'm Linda Lamusford, normally the producer behind the camera. But today I'm so honored to be here with staff writer for The New Yorker, Susan Orlean. She has just published a new book, Rin Tin Tin, The Life and the Legend. But a lot of us gardeners know her from The Orchid Thief. Fabulous to have you. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here.
Well, tell us what kind of started The Orchid Thief? For the people who haven't read it yet or haven't yet heard about it, what was the story behind it?
It was a complete accident, I have to say. I remember at some point while I was working on the book saying, if you had asked me, would I be walking through a swamp in South Florida looking for wild orchids, I would have said, you're crazy. What happened was I was flying home from a vacation. I'd run out of things to read. I was rustling around in the seat pocket, which, normally you don't want to go in there very far. But someone had left a Miami Herald in there. And I thought, well, I'll just browse through it. I was bored. And I always like to look for the little stories that are kind of tucked in the corners of a newspaper. And I saw this headline, local nurseryman arrested with rare orchids. And I thought, well, that's a weird story. I think I'll read that. And it described this arrest that had just taken place. Now, to give you an idea of how naive I was and how ignorant I was of orchids at the time, I thought, I didn't know orchids grew wild. I didn't know you could find orchids in South Florida. And also, more significantly, I thought, why would you steal orchids out of a swamp? Why wouldn't you just go to Home Depot and buy them? It was the kind of story that I couldn't resist. I remember tearing out the piece from the newspaper, and I thought, this might be a great story. When I got back to New York, I went into my editor and I said, I have no idea what this is about, but there's something interesting here. So I went back to Florida, sat in at the initial hearing in the arrest of John LaRoche and a few Seminole men who were with him to hear, what was this all about? Why would you steal orchids? The minute I saw John LaRoche, and he is one of the more fascinating characters you could imagine coming across, in the middle of his hearing, he announced to the judge that he was the smartest person he knew. And I thought, I like this guy. I mean, as a subject, sure. I like this guy. And his description of why he was pursuing the orchids was just absolutely fascinating. Everything connected to the orchid world, all of which was new to me, was completely intriguing. And I just knew I had to keep working on it and write a book.
And so how long a process was it to write a book like this?
It probably was about 3.5 years, all told, working pretty steadily on it. And I spent a lot of time back down in Florida with John LaRoche, with other orchid growers, as well as a lot of time in libraries doing a lot of historical research, which I had no idea there was this rich, complex, absolutely intriguing history of orchids as botanical creatures and also historical, the story of orchids in our culture and what people have done in order to obtain them.
That's one of the things I love about the book is the history of passion, really, and then the evolutionary aspects of orchids, and just some of the botanical things that fascinate us, like how they breed and how long it takes. And then you describe some of the weather aspects and how some of these orchids show up. Like, what is the thing of the seeds along the median? What is that all about?
It was an amazing realization during, the terrible hurricane that had come in and actually wrecked much of the orchid industry in Florida. And it was really sad, and a lot of people's livelihoods were lost. Thousands of orchids smashed, and greenhouses, of course, are not very sturdy structures, and in a hurricane, they're going to be flattened. And there's by the way, no insurance that will cover the value of those plants because they fall somewhere in between being agricultural and being something else. But one of the interesting outcomes that a lot of scientists mentioned to me is that a hurricane will bring new plants to an area. And it'll lift seeds, and particularly orchid seeds, which are so fine and so tiny, so they're very easily carried in air currents. Bring them, drop them down. And 7 years later, you may see what got blown up from Mexico in the latest hurricane. It's how certain species, like the ghost orchid, probably got to Florida to begin with, that they were carried on air currents in a storm, rather than some plants which are carried by birds, by insects. Orchid seeds are too fine to fall into that category. And I just thought, this is amazing. This is just remarkable. So scientists were saying, 7, 8 years after a big hurricane, it's always interesting to see what species, non-native species, will pop up. It has to be carried there in the wind. It has to fall into an environment, a microenvironment that's actually suitable for that seed. It has to not get eaten. It has to, so there are a lot of factors that go into it. And that's why it's kind of remarkable that these plants, which have a very almost human desire to live and propagate, will carry on.
I think that's amazing. And I think one thing that's fascinating is that they do it and that we treasure that. Gardeners can have an exceeding amount of patience to wait 7 or 8 years for a plant, but it all starts with passion. You find one little plant, or like you said, you would go to all these shows and stare into the petals. What is the craziest, most fun orchid that you remember? There are countless that you saw.
I know. Well, there was one that I had said, I'm not going to start collecting orchids. I'm doing this book as a journalist. I am not going to collect orchids. And of course, writing about people who are very passionate, as these people were, and being exposed to not the garden variety orchid that you get at Home Depot, but the most amazing, rare, beautiful orchids in the world. And having people say, come on, take one. And I kept saying, no, stop, I don't want to. But there were incredible ones, beautiful, these vandas that I don't think I'd ever seen a vanda before. Amazing colors, some that smelled like chocolate, some of the ones that were most incredible were the orchids that look exactly like the insect that pollinates them. So much so that no one could argue against Darwin after seeing one of these orchids that looks exactly like the pollinator, and that they trick the insect, or in some cases a bat or a moth, into thinking it's a mate.
That was
and
incredible.
The insect or bat or whatever will mate, of course, to no good end, but
who knows?
Yeah,
who
that's
knows
true.
what's
Never
going to happen
actually.
someday?
Who knows exactly? And in some cases, they've evolved to look like an enemy of the insect it needs. It's almost eerie.
It is.
It was something that, first of all, made you appreciate the enormity of time in the universe, because the millions and millions of genetic changes that had to take place to make this plant look like this insect. We're talking billions of years of incremental changes, and it was awe-inspiring. It really humbled me to think we're just this tiny little speck compared to what has led to these plants with their remarkable variety and their incredible talent for being alive.
Well, I love this book, and if you read The Orchid Thief a few years ago, but now you're a gardener and you want to hear some evolutionary tales, some incredible stories of passion, and learn something about the evolution of life and a little bit more about Susan herself, please do check out The Orchid Thief. And thank you so much for being here.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes. And now we're on to our friend Daphne Richards.
Hi, I'm Daphne Richards, and this is Augie. Our question of the week comes from David about slime mold. He's found it in mulched pathways and garden beds, and he wants to know if it's harmful and what to do about it. Well, with all the rain we've had this spring, and with the temperatures so warm, this substance has been showing up in many gardens. In fact, my friend Mike, who works for the Austin Fire Department, recently told me that he responded to a call from a school to check on a possible hazardous material found on the children's playground. So what did it turn out to be? Slime mold. Slime molds are unique creatures that don't fit into any categories that we're familiar with. Although they have fungus-like characteristics, they aren't fungi. They exist in nature as a blob that's often bright yellow and even sometimes red. Their preferred food source? Bacteria. They occur when there is high relative humidity and relatively warm temperatures, exactly the conditions that we had this spring. So on to David's actual question. Are slime molds harmful, and what should we do about them? Although they are unsightly, dare I say gross, they're not harmful to humans or animals, and they'll run their course fairly quickly, so there's no need to do anything about them unless you can't stand to look at them, in which case simply remove and toss them in the garbage or compost pile, or just break them up with a rake or a strong jet of water. If slime mold returns, even when we aren't getting rain, it would be because the area is being over-irrigated. Our plant of the week is winecup, Caloroi involucrata. Winecups are perennial and are listed to be slightly deer resistant, which basically means that the deer will probably choose to eat all the other plants in your garden before they eat this one. Winecups form a beautiful sprawling mat across the surface of the ground, and they're covered in flowers from very early spring until the heat of summer arrives. They need very little water and require very well-drained soil, performing best in shallow, gravelly areas and even preferring the small cracks between landscape pavers to a richly amended garden bed. So be careful using organic mulches around this plant or it might rot. Winecup gets only about 6 to 12 inches tall, including the flower stalk, but it can spread up to 5 feet wide. In late summer, you should trim back any dead growth that occurred due to the heat, which will encourage a flush of growth in the fall. Winecup should also be pruned back to its base in late winter before the new spring growth emerges. Another great thing about winecup is that it grows very easily from seed, so that you can establish plenty of them in your garden without a lot of expense. As with our other wildflowers, winecup seeds should be sown in the fall, while transplants should be planted in the spring. And be sure to plant your winecups in full sun. To do this week, it's time to divide any of your spring flowering bulbs that have now begun to die back and turn brown on top. You should also collect seeds from your spring annuals such as bluebonnets. And if you're still looking to plant a vegetable or two, it's not too late to plant beans, corn, squash, peppers, and lots of others. Just be very mindful of the heat and keep them watered well. We'd love to hear from you, so please visit klru.org/ctg to send us your question or plant of the week from your garden.
Thanks, Daphne. Now let's check in with Trisha Shirey for Backyard Basics.
We spend a lot of our time in the garden weeding, and we can make those weeds work for us. Fast-growing weeds are a rich source of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as hormones and trace minerals. When we drink tea from herbs, we get the vitamins, minerals, essential oils extracted from the plants, and our body takes up the nutrients. Plants can do the same with weed tea. You can give transplants a boost when they're actively growing with weed tea. So to make a quick tea, you can use charred alfalfa or comfrey and just chop it coarsely. Add it to a blender. About 2 cups of plant material added to a blender, cover with hot water and then blend thoroughly. Let it cool and then strain it with a spine sieve, cheesecloth, or a coffee filter, and then you can add the herbs to your compost pile or use as mulch. As the tea cools, then use it as a soil drench or use it as a fertilizer for indoor or outdoor plants. Swiss chard has calcium, phosphorus, vitamin A, B12, C, and trace minerals. There are many other weeds that you can use. This is going to be a longer brew weed feed tea that I like to make, and you just use whatever you have growing. There's going to be a list of herbs to choose from as well as directions on our website, but mix as many weeds as possible for the best array of nutrients. Now this tea can be messy and smelly, so keep it away from the house, but many organic fertilizers can be pretty smelly anyway. If you've ever used fish emulsion, you know what I'm talking about. People made their own fertilizers for centuries from things like this before they were able to buy them from the store. So some things you can use would be comfrey, chard, equisetum, lamb's quarter, nettles, willow branches, chickweed, dandelions, dried and chopped eggshells, coffee grounds, cleavers, chamomile, lawn clippings, all kinds of things. And you'll just coarsely chop these weeds and place them in a mesh bag. I use these produce bags and just chop it up fairly large. And the mesh bag strains out the larger particles of the weed tea and just makes it easier to use the finished tea. You don't have to do this step. You can just put the chopped material in the bucket loose, but then you'll want to cover this material with either rainwater or a water that doesn't have chlorine in it. So if you've got tap water, just let that tap water sit out for a week or so before you brew a weed tea, because the chlorine is going to kill the microbes that are going to break down the nutrients in the weeds. Let this stand for several days. If you chop up your weeds, it's going to work faster, just like with compost. The smaller the material, the faster it brews. Again, it is pretty smelly, so don't do this close to the house. And you'll want to put a cover over the 5-gallon bucket, either a solid cover or at least do a mosquito cover to keep the mosquitoes out. I use row cover with a bungee cord or window screening, everything, something like that. And then stir it every few days and then strain this. Just pull the mesh bag out. You could also use a pillowcase. Add 1 part of the tea to 4 or 5 parts of water. You want it to be fairly diluted. And then water around your plants, not on the foliage. This could have microbes that could be harmful, so you don't want to use it on edible plants at harvest time. And then add the tea residues to the compost pile and start over another batch of brew. Remember to go to our website to find out more information about which weeds to use and the ways to do it. For Backyard Basics, I'm Trisha Shirey.
Visit klru.org/CTG to watch online and find out more. Next week, check out Texas Superstar Plants. Until then, I'll see you in the garden.
To learn about today's program, watch online and follow CTG's blog. Check out klru.org/CTG.
Support for Central Texas Gardener comes from GeoGrowers, offering custom soil blends for lawns, gardens, xeriscaping, and organic landscaping supplies. More information at geogrowers.net. And also from The Blanket, a plant covering designed to be lightweight, breathable, and water resistant to help keep plants warm and dry during harsh winter weather. TheBlanket.com.